Dr. Terrence Moore is a highly accomplished man. A former lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps, he received a PhD in history from the University of Edinburgh, served as a principal of a top classical charter school in Colorado, like Dr. Bob mentioned, is an advisor for Hillsdale's Barney Charter School Initiative, and most recently published a novel about boyhood, baseball, and his home state of Texas. During my 2.5 years at Hillsdale, I've taken several classes with Dr. Moore. Every meeting, he led us through lively discussions, drawing students into the text, inviting us to dwell with the best thinkers, political actors, theologians, philosophers who have ever been, studying their understanding of human nature and man's responsibility in history. He walked us through the Pilgrim's Path in Augustine's City of God and taught Lincoln's Gettysburg Address as the greatest American poem. By tracing the ideas throughout the Western heritage, he showed me the power of ideas and that ideas have consequences. It is now my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Terrence Moore.
Thank you, Miss Willoughby. How are you all doing? All right? Survived the weather, the inauguration, and other various and sundry aspects of D.C. Okay, well, I'll just get right down to it. One of my favorite philosophers, Adam Smith, in a very famous book, launched the discipline known then as political economy, and that we now call economics, with the aid of a single simple object, a pen. By showing how the division of labor produced 40,000 times the number of pens a single person could make in a day, he proved that the combined effects of millions of people, all following their enlightened self-interest and natural talents in the making and exchanging of goods, were superior to the top-down direction of the ridiculous imperial economic system known as mercantilism. Now, though I'm not nearly the genius that Adam Smith was, despite Ms. Malika's very kind comments, I hope at least to be able to shed light on the workings of what I shall call civil society with an illustration almost as basic: the clothing closet. The clothing closet at a charter school I ran in Colorado was not an actual closet. It was rather a collection of used school uniforms that were put on sale about once a month at steeply discounted prices. The source of the uniforms was simply children outgrowing them and their parents donating the general supply of clothes. All sorts of families got their children's clothes at the clothing closet: rich, middle income, and poor. As fast as children shoot through clothes, particularly in elementary school, there is no shame in not wanting to lay out a lot of money for things your children may be wearing only for a few months. Furthermore, those families who were known to be poor, qualifying for free and reduced lunch in bureaucratic terms, were provided with school uniforms from the clothing closet for free. So the greater economy in the purchase of school clothing at the school owed to a series of decisions and activities. The policy of the school requiring the children to wear uniforms in the first place, rather than having the halls turn into a high-pressure and expensive fashion show. The adopting of a reasonable uniform that could be purchased inexpensively at stores like Target and Kohl's, who are sponsoring this program today, by the way. The willingness of families to donate their children's clothes once they had outgrown them. The volunteer spirit of a few mothers who were willing to manage the clothing closet, keeping the administration, that is me, as far out of it as possible. And the discretion of one person working at the school who knew all the poorer families and would supply them with what they needed. So that's how it worked, and the families loved it. When you think about it, the clothing closet was simply an extension of what goes on in homes. Any second or third or fourth child of the same sex is usually wearing things that have been worn before. It should not surprise us that the word economy, economics, and economize come from the Greek word oikos, or ekos, which means family. The family, the basic unit of society, is best run economically. Besides that, there is more care and compassion shown in the home than in government-run programs. Economy and true compassion, those are virtues worth having. Well, what happens when governments get involved in school clothing? You may think they don't, but there are currently 2 states I can find, West Virginia and Michigan, where Hillsdale College is, that do have school clothing allowances for the poor. One state senator in Michigan in 2011 tried to require those receiving the funds to shop at thrift stores, and he was nearly burned at the stake. Realize that this is a program that other states don't even have, but that didn't stop NPR from getting involved. And you may know that federal stimulus money was handed out in some states for back-to-school shopping. I have an article here detailing how in New York, George Soros added $35 million of his own to the $140 million handout that had to be spent before the funds expired in 2009. $200 per child, we were told, magically appeared. Those are not my words, but the reporters. Magically appeared on the benefit cards of those receiving welfare or food stamps. It's free money, said one of the recipients of the no strings attached handout. Thank God for Obama. He's looking out for us. The state of New Mexico also used stimulus funds in 2011 for a school clothing allowance. European countries do this regularly, so why shouldn't the U.S.? This may seem far-fetched, but we're in the second term of Obama. If we go this way, don't be surprised if Jay-Z and Beyonce come out with a new line of designer jeans that somehow are paid for that with that $200. What's wrong with sharing a little back-to-school wealth? Well, economically and politically, there are a few things. The stimulus money, or any other such funds, had to travel through what Reagan called the Puzzle Palace on the Potomac. And as you know, and as Reagan also said, somewhere there must be some overhead. The stimulus itself does not seem to me to be constitutional, but I tend to be a literalist on these matters. And the stimulus money, or any taxes imposed to provide for school clothing or free school lunches, which Milton Friedman said do not exist, undisputedly takes money out of the private sector and further derails economic recovery. But I wish to hone in on a different aspect of the problem. Such federal programs inhibit the activity of what we might call civil society. Civil society is a vital term for a free people, one not often used today, so I'll try to explain it. Civil society in the primary sense is the equivalent of we the people. The American people preceded the government. In fact, the American people constituted the government. And the American people to this day hold the government accountable, or at least are supposed to. Civil society, then, arranges government in such a way to accomplish certain defined ends and works through government to achieve those ends. In President Reagan's formulation, we are a nation that has a government, not the other way around. Government, of course, is divided into both different branches and different levels to attend to the different offices of government, to effect greater energy and efficiency, and to prevent consolidation of excessive governmental power. That is all pretty straightforward, although I must say the ability of most modern office holders to articulate these basic constitutional principles is minimal. Not all office holders, but many of them. At any rate, the activity of civil society does not stop at government. The American people also work through what we might call the economy, which has a natural system of cause and effect based upon both human beings' need for basic necessities, but also on their innate desire to create things and to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. And we know, or ought to know, that the government must be both strong and efficient for the economy to work well, and that when government exceeds its warrant, the economy is undermined. But there is a third realm of human activity through which the American people work to achieve certain ends. This arena I do not have a good name for, so I shall call it also civil society, just like the first civil society. This arena may involve government activity, mainly at the local level, and it may involve economic exchange, yet it is neither primarily political nor economic. What I have in mind are people working together, largely outside of government, at least outside of the federal government, to solve their problems and make their lives better. Civil society in this sense does not exclude actions of government, yet when civil society is robust and effective, most affairs are taken care of without direct governmental assistance, or alternatively, with government operating at the lowest and most accountable level possible and with the least bureaucracy possible. Now, professors get paid to throw around a lot of celebrated names and abstruse books whenever they get into a jam. So that's what I'm going to do now. For civil society, in the first sense, I invoke John Locke, the coming together of a people to secure life, liberty, and property. For government, I mean the Constitution and its exegesis in The Federalist. By economy, I mean what Adam Smith detailed in his inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. And by civil society in the second sense, I refer mostly to what Tocqueville called associations. In his second volume of Democracy in America, Tocqueville claims that the flourishing of associations is vital to maintaining freedom in a democracy. In fact, he goes so far as saying that the science of associations is the mother of all sciences in a democracy. And he further argues that if a democracy were to lose its genius for creating associations in ordinary life, not just freedom, but civilization itself would be in peril. I want to dwell on this realm of the American people's civil life today, not only because it is the least talked about, but also because I believe the progressive assault on civil society is ultimately the most un-American part of their agenda and will have the most destructive consequences if that agenda is not squashed. To better illustrate the workings of civil society, I shall call on two important figures in American history who understood the thriving of free associations, Benjamin Franklin and Ronald Reagan. Benjamin Franklin may be the most astonishing figure in American history. How many of you are Benjamin Franklin fans? Okay, it should be all of you. If you're not convinced of that, I shall convince you of this shortly. Franklin had only 2 years of formal education, but acquired a rigorous self-education in history, philosophy, and essay writing, all undertaken in his spare time while working for his father as a candle maker, and later for his older brother in a print shop. By the time he was 16, he had tricked his brother into publishing his own series of essays, that is, Franklin's series of essays, under the pseudonym Silence Dogood in one of the 4 newspapers in the colonies. That series became the first such endeavor in American literature. One of the essays was a satire on Harvard College. Another contemplated establishing an insurance fund for the relief of widows. Now, my guess is there were not too many 16-year-old boys looking out for the welfare of widows in the entire English-speaking world in the 18th century. Also at the age of 16, Franklin ended up running the entire paper when his brother was thrown in jail for opposing the colonial administration in Boston. The responsibility went to his head, he quarreled with his brother, and that quarrel led to the 17-year-old's leaving Boston, violating his terms of indentures, and arriving disheveled in Philadelphia with no contacts, no prospects, only a Dutch dollar to his name. Franklin humorously described the scene of his arrival in the city where he would make his mark in his autobiography. Perhaps not as obvious as how disheveled and unformed, though full of life and opportunity, the town of Philadelphia must have been before Franklin's living there. Beginning as an employee in a print shop, Franklin, after a 2-year trip to London, ended up owning his own printing press and newspaper by the time he was 24. He worked tirelessly, and, not impressed with the theological bickering of the time, and disappointed that his church did not preach the value of good morals, the young man conceived, quote, the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. Franklin created his own moral system, not surprisingly emphasizing the virtues of industry and frugality and resolution, and yes, chastity. But he was pragmatic on the virtue of chastity, insisting that one should use venery rarely and only for health or offspring, and never to the injury of one's own or another's reputation. Now, depending on how much rarely means and how much venery is needed for health, we can say that Franklin was as good as his word, at least in not harming another's reputation. We still don't know who the mother of his oldest son, William, was. Franklin was not an ordinary printer. He did not just print useful publications. He went out of his way to entertain and to instruct the public. His popular Poor Richard's Almanac is a good example. In addition to providing the farming community with useful information about the weather and planting, he filled the almanac with amusing moral maxims, such as, lost time is never found again. There are no gains without pains. You thought that was original, did you? No. Early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. 'Tis hard for an empty sack to stand upright. Creditors have better memories than debtors. And my favorite, dost thou love life? Then do not waste time, for time is the stuff that life is made of. These may sound like commonplaces, But presumably the avid readers of Franklin's almanac plied their children at the appropriate moments with these sayings. His final compilation of these maxims were put in the form of Father Abraham's speech at the auction, otherwise known as The Way to Wealth, that was printed throughout Europe and America. What we must realize is that Franklin was not just printing an almanac, he was shaping the American character. While Franklin was establishing himself as a printer and writer, he also found time for public projects. Many of these were an extension of his own spirit of self-improvement and curiosity in all things human and natural. The most important of these was perhaps the Junto, a group of young tradesmen who were, like Franklin, establishing themselves in business and the community. They got together regularly to discuss topics on any point of morals, politics, and natural philosophy, that is, science. Questions included topics such as why dew forms on the outside of tankards containing cold water during the summer, whether immigration of servants increases the wealth of a country, whether there should be an insurance fund for servants. There's that topic of insurance again. And what constitutes the happiness of a rational creature. In other words, these young working men in their spare time were undertaking a college education, we might add without a federal student loan program. Since the Junto was both a small society for self-improvement and a means of local improvement, Franklin helped improve the world around him. Many of his civic-minded projects had their origin in the Junto. Most notably, the formation of the first lending library in the colonies began as the Junto's need for books and Franklin's design to make them more available to poorer and younger folks. That institution was copied throughout the colonies. The formation of the first fire company began as Franklin's writing articles on the brave men who fight fires and the means of preventing fires. After a paper given in the Junto, the first fire company was formed, making Philadelphia, after a time, and with much more reiteration of the fire company, in Franklin's view, probably better than any city in the world in putting out fires. A spirit of civic duty led to the saving of life and property. Franklin was a veritable industry of institutional foundation and reform. He started the Pennsylvania militia without support from the Assembly. He set up an academy that served as the embryo of the University of Pennsylvania. He initiated the first attempt at colonial union in response to tensions between France and England. That was called the Albany Union, for which he designed the first truly American political cartoon, a severed snake with the caption, "Join or Die." He improved the city watch of Philadelphia. He initiated the paving of the streets of Philadelphia. He reformed the colonial post office and helped establish the Continental Post Office. He founded the American Philosophical Society. He launched a hospital for the poor. And he was the moving force behind erecting a large hall to accommodate the preaching of the evangelist George Whitefield, which later served both the academy he founded and as a gathering place for religious speakers of any religious denomination. These institutions led to his own improvement and the improvement of civil society. Not one of these institutions came as a directive from England, least of all from the British ministry or local colonial officials. Franklin got on well with the leading lights of the Scottish and English Enlightenment, but not so much with governments. And when Franklin went to England, he was usually the one being consulted. For example, on setting up lightning rods or improving the street lights of London. Moreover, what is important to know is that, as busy as he was, Franklin mastered all of these enterprises. He thought about them. When he undertook the project of setting up an English school, for example, he read the leading philosophers of the day on the topic and quoted them extensively in his 2 lengthy and detailed essays on the subject. Now, I've read these essays dozens of times, and they're still wonderful. In fact, the schools that we're talking about setting up, if you want to know what they look like, read Franklin. That's what they are. We're not inventing anything new. Franklin understood how institutions worked, and he explained them to people. He did not just spout platitudes about needing better schools for Philadelphia to give children critical thinking skills so they could get good jobs in an 18th century global economy. He worked out a school from top to bottom, including the books that would be read by the children. Franklin's various civic activities improved the lives of those around them. He was also instrumental in shaping the American character. Franklin once said in an essay that an American is not known for who he is. For who he is. That is, what his name is, or what his patrimony is, or what social station he comes from. Rather, an American is known for what he can do. Franklin was living proof that the son of a candle maker with lots of drive and a love of his fellow man, and obviously genius to spare, could, with the help of other like-minded people, accomplish wonders. Many of those accomplishments were in politics and in economics. Franklin was obviously indispensable in winning the Revolution. As early as 1729, he wrote an essay on the need for a paper currency in America. Yet the charge of the Marxists that Franklin was simply the embodiment of the bourgeois materialist is not true. Because of Franklin's enterprise, scientific inquiry, sociability, and constant quest to improve the world around him, at the time of his death in 1790, the people of Philadelphia were not only freer and wealthier than they had been before his arrival 67 years before, they were also better read, more educated, safer from fires, more cared for when sick, less dusty, warmer in the winter, better able to see in old age, safer from lightning, more informed about the world, more entertained, more given to civic-minded projects of all kinds, friendlier and more in touch with their neighboring states, and more confident in themselves than they had been before this runaway apprentice showed up in their town. One more consideration. Is it an accident that virtually no regular public school in the country still requires its students to read Franklin's autobiography? Is this not something of a national oversight? Everybody used to read Franklin's autobiography. We turn now to Ronald Reagan. It seems to me vital to this nation that we get the Reagan story right. In Reagan, we have the lesson, the proof, that the American experiment in self-government works. Moreover, it did not just work in the old horse and buggy days, before big cities, before running water, before computers, as the progressive left would have you believe. The American experiment in liberty and self-government, in free markets, and a vibrant civil society works in the age of cities in the millions, of man making it to the moon, of television and computers. It is the progressive experiment that does not work in the modern or any other age, and it leaves everything behind it in shambles, particularly the vitality of civil society. To understand Reagan and his faith in America, we do have to turn back the clock a little to take a look at the world he grew up in. Here's Reagan. With nearly 10,000 people, Dixon was more than 10 times larger than Tampico. We arrived there in 1920 when I was 9 years old, and to me, it was heaven. Dixon had a busy main street lined with shops, several churches, an elementary and a high school, a public library, a post office, a wire screen factory, a shoe factory, and a cement plant. At the outskirts of town, dairy farms stretched as far as you could see. It was a small universe where I learned standards and values that would guide me for the rest of my life. Almost everybody knew one another, and because they knew one another, they tended to care about each other. If the family down the street had a crisis, a death, or serious illness, a neighbor brought them dinner that night. If a farmer lost his barn to a fire, his friends would pitch in and help him rebuild it. At church, you prayed side by side with your neighbors, and if things were going wrong for them, you prayed for them, and knew they prayed for you if things went wrong for you. The scene of small-town America in the early 20th century comes straight from Reagan's autobiography, and it was etched in his memory his whole life. But there were other memories he had of Dixon. These memories came from the beginning of the breakdown of civil society, or near breakdown. And that breakdown did not take place in the cities or among a racial minority. It came in small-town Midwestern America. You see, Reagan's father, as one of the few Democrats in Dixon, was appointed head of the New Deal programs for the area and was eventually in charge of the WPA. While in college, Reagan remembers visiting his father at the government office and seeing men who had worked their whole lives standing in line for relief funds and supplies. They were clearly dispirited. You could read it in their eyes and in the way that they stood. A working man himself, Reagan's father knew how important a job is, not just for a man's material well-being, but for what we would now casually dismiss in pseudo-Freudian terms as his ego, his sense of pride and self-worth. So the father got these men little odd jobs around the county that made the men feel like they were doing something for their relief checks. They were grateful. They stood taller. But then the men stopped coming for those jobs. He asked why. It was because they were told by other relief agencies that they would lose their benefits if it looked like they had a job. When Reagan's father was appointed to administer the WPA a little bit later, the men again stopped signing up as they had at first because the welfare arm of the New Deal came into town and told the men that they did not need the WPA to get direct benefits. The men were caught between the rival bureaucracies trying to protect its own turf. Now that is a part of the New Deal that we were not told about in the history books. We were told that FDR said, "Let there be government jobs," and there were government jobs. We were not told that the leading jobs program, the New Deal, was undermined by the welfare part of the bureaucracy trying to keep itself alive. For Reagan, it was never the job so much as the human cost of large governmental projects. Those men in Dixon, fortunately, had enough spirit left in them to go back to jobs whenever they finally became available, not really until after the war. But Reagan knew that the Great Society would undermine the very basis of civil society, the desire of a man to make something of himself and to provide for those he loves. Reagan understood that the basis of civil society is the family, and that nothing should be more protected by government than the family. Yet it was precisely the family that big government liberals were trying to undermine, or were undermining, whether intentionally or not. In a crucial part of his 1964 televised address on behalf of Barry Goldwater, Reagan told a story of a woman who had come before a judge. The woman had 6 children and was on her 7th, about to have it. She wanted to divorce her husband, not because they had a falling out, but because she could get more aid from the Aid to Dependent Children program than her husband made at his job. The idea came from 2 other women in her neighborhood. Instead of women in the neighborhood pitching in to help each other out under the old model of civil society, they were coming up with ways to trick the system. There was the genesis of the breakdown of the family in the 20th century. Reagan wryly remarked, "Yet any time you and I question the schemes of the do-gooders, we are denounced as being against their humanitarian goals. They say we are always against things, never for anything. Well, the trouble with our liberal friends is not that they are ignorant, it's just that they know so much that isn't so." Yet Reagan was not just a critic of the failures of the welfare state, though he was that. He was also the muse of civil society when it worked as it should. One thing we are rarely told about Reagan in our school and college classrooms also concerns the breakdown of civil society, this time during the 60s, specifically the youth movement. We are told that the hippies marched for civil rights and against a war that could not be won. We are not told about the violence, the mobs, the plots to kill federal judges, just as we were not told that the communist plot to take over Hollywood was real. In that one, Reagan had to, in the Hollywood issue, Reagan had to carry a gun and was shadowed by a federal agent because insurgents into a Hollywood union threatened to throw acid into his face. At any rate, Reagan, there in the 60s, was right there in the middle of it as governor of California. And he saw the fundamental breakdown of one aspect of civil society, the very basic social practice of young people listening to and taking advice from older, wiser people. How many people in this room think that that's a good thing to happen? Okay, younger people, you're supposed to raise your hands too. Reagan actually talked to young people. He made fun of them when he needed to, saying that those who carried "Make Love, Not War" signs looked like they couldn't do much of either, and a host of other things that were also funny. But he also told moving stories of the men of his generation to explain that generation to the young, if they were listening. And he also could see that not every young person in America was a rioter of what he called the have torch, will travel variety. Here's one moving description of a young man in action given by Reagan when he was speaking at his own college, Eureka, in 1967. Some time ago in Newport, California, a row of luxurious oceanfront homes were threatened by an abnormally high tide and heavy surf. All through the day and night, volunteers worked, piling sandbags in an effort to save these homes. Local TV stations, aware of the drama, covered the struggle. It was about 2 a.m. when one newscaster grabbed a young fellow in his teens, attired only in wet trunks. He had been working all day and night, one of several hundred of his age group. No, he did not live in one of the homes that they were trying to save, and yes, he was cold and tired. The newscaster inevitably got around to why. The answer was so poignant, such an indictment of so many of us, it should be on a billboard across the nation. He said, "Well, I guess it's the first time we've ever felt like we were needed." What Reagan is describing there to young people at his own college was not a federal program or an ambitious Ivy League graduate padding his resume at a nonprofit before moving on to a career in politics. What he was describing is the good in all of us, the spirit that made America great. This is the spirit Reagan stood for and spent his entire life trying to rekindle. Some may not realize that his first speech he gave at GE, as a goodwill ambassador during touring plants around the country, consisted in remarks he made about a local charitable event in which he distinguished between private charities on the one hand and government programs that spent $2 for every dollar that the people actually got who were supposed to be supported. The people at that gathering liked his remarks so much that his handshaking and meet and greet tours turned into a formal speech-making effort at both GE and local organizations, where he extolled the virtues of private initiative in matters of local concern and the failure of government in matters of local concern. Not surprisingly, when he left office 25 years later, after having brought about the Reagan Revolution, one of the statistics he liked quoting even more than the 19 million jobs created, even more than inflation going from 14% to 1%, was the nearly 60% rise in charitable giving and the 50 million Americans working for or giving to private charities. These were not just statistics for Reagan. Behind every new job, there was a man or woman who could walk with his head held high. Behind each dip in inflation, there were millions of families who could plan for the future. And behind each charitable donation, there was a good heart willing to give. There is a reason why I'm talking about Franklin and Reagan in this dismal political and economic time in our nation's history. It is not to dwell on a particular policy that they advocated, nor a winning political strategy that they conceived. It is because Franklin and Reagan were America's best teachers on the strengths of a vibrant civil society. Neither one of them looked at politics from the perspective of a beltway. They looked at political life from the perspective of towns and neighborhoods. Family, work, neighborhood, peace, and freedom were the 5 powerful words Reagan invoked in his acceptance speech in 1980, when the country was in economic turmoil and suffering from, our current president lectured us, malaise. In being a great teacher, Reagan did not just throw statistics at us, nor platitudes. He told stories, just as Franklin had told stories in his newspaper. Stories that both amused and instructed because they rang true in the human heart. We began this talk by saying something about school clothing allowances. We think it is a bad idea. At least I do. We think it is unconstitutional. We think it is a transparent buying of votes. But not everyone sees it that way, and not only those who are receiving the handouts. Someone must tell the other side of the story. And that side of the story cannot be told until we remember what civil society is supposed to look like and how our cities and towns are rapidly losing that memory. Not too long ago, a small group of public-spirited men and women with whom Hillsdale College is working in setting up a charter school in a poor neighborhood in one of the historic cities of this country went to a town meeting to hear people offer their comments on the opening of the school. Many of the people who came to the meeting did not want the school in their neighborhood. Now, that's not terribly disturbing because wherever you put schools in this great land, people always come out and say they don't want them. They fear the traffic and all the congestion that schools will create. More telling was what one woman said at the meeting who lived in this neighborhood. She asked the planning board and the crowd at large, who would want to set up a good school in this neighborhood? Who would want to set up a good school in this neighborhood? And that question told the whole story. Not only do the people in that neighborhood in this great country not know how to set up a school themselves, something that every little outpost in America used to be able to do, they cannot even imagine anyone ever wanting to do that for them or to do that with them, which is even more important. Are the $200 clothing allowance is going to buy back the lost knowledge of self-government and the lost faith in the one thing that people have to believe in, themselves? I don't think so. Well, where to start? Well, what I would like to see are some statesmen and other public figures who stop trying to guess what rib the electorate once tickled, and start trying to tell the stories that are plain to see in the country today. And I would like more said about what we used to call civil society. It is as though at every election we agree to a silly division of labor in who gets to talk about what. The Republicans get to talk about the economy and only the economy, and they usually do so in numbers that do not register in human terms, while the Democrats get to talk about everything else. The universities and the schools and scientific research that they fund to get the results that they want. And they get to talk about the culture at large. The Republicans look like they are rich and only interested in material things. The Democrats look broad-minded and multifaceted. What would such a new rhetoric look like, which is really an old rhetoric? Well, I am not exactly sure. I think it would tell stories about what this country once looked like when people were self-governing, not as an historical exercise, but as an indication of what it can be again. And where civil society is still thriving, those stories should be told too. But I think such a message might begin with what I call the aggressive Socratic mode. Ms. Willoughby knows about the aggressive Socratic mode. I think it is high time that these high-minded, supposedly intellectual types, these sophists, really be asked a few questions so that they would be forced, as Reagan said, to tell us the score once in a while. Those questions might include the following. Mr. President, just over 4 years ago, you inspired the American people with the phrase, "Yes, we can." And that is a true American sentiment. But, Mr. President, you played a little rhetorical trick on us. You never told us who the we are. Clearly, you did not mean we to be the American people, because your record after 4 years shows that you do not really trust the American people to live their own lives and carve out their own destinies. By we, you must have meant the federal government. If I am mistaken, then I wish you would clear up the point and clear up the record, because from what I can tell, you and your party do not think the American people can do anything on their own. They cannot buy a car on their own, and they wouldn't know to buy the right car in the first place. They cannot go to their local hardware store to buy a light bulb on their own without, we are told, destroying the whole planet. They cannot send their kids to college on their own. They cannot go to a doctor on their own. They cannot save up for and buy a house on their own, and we're still paying for that one. They cannot light or warm houses on their own. They cannot buy their children's school supplies on their own or pack their children's school lunches. Mr. President, according to you, we live in a world in which fathers no longer know what to tell their sons to do when their sons are confronted by a bully at school. So you have a ridiculous anti-bullying summit and put up a silly website called stopbullying.gov. On that website, you tell young people being picked on not to bully back. Mr. President, my father taught me a different lesson. He didn't say not bully back. That phrase didn't make any sense to him. He had an altogether different lesson. And Mr. President, I am guessing that the SEALs that took out Osama bin Laden were not taught by their fathers to not bully back. I am guessing that the Marines and SEALs and soldiers and sailors and airmen of this great country, to say nothing of the police, gave those bullies a right good drubbing when they were in school. But what is more worrisome is why you as President of the United States, with our national defense to worry about, why you are inserting yourself as a father. Is it because your policies and the policy of the Democrats over the last 50 years have left too few fathers in our families and neighborhoods? Is it because bullying now does not mean the roughhousing we find in the first chapter of Tom Sawyer, but because of your policies, bullying has turned into gang violence involving guns and knives and events called drive-bys and curbings hitherto unknown in this great country, but that have become all too regular and are, by the way, celebrated by the multi-million-dollar so-called musical artists you claim to listen to and certainly hang out with. Mr. President, you say you're going to put 100,000 teachers in the schools across America. Well, that sounds great. But we know by now that these large promises translate into more unionization and more school bureaucracy, and not one child in 100 learning how to read, write, and think about good and beautiful things. Mr. President, can you point to what has happened in our schools over the last 60 years when your party has run them to say this is what we need more of? Do we look to the schools of Illinois, and specifically Chicago, where you come from and your Secretary of Education comes from, in a state and a city that are run by Democrats from top to bottom, and see a model of success? We do know that politicians' children do not go to these schools, ever. Rather than the 100,000 teachers you promised to put in the classrooms, let us talk instead about the millions of parents in both suburb and city who are pulling their children out of the schools your associates are in charge of, who are homeschooling, both for the sake of their children's learning and their moral compass that is led astray in the schools you have given us. And those who are saving every dime to have enough to put their children into private schools, or who are on waiting lists that number in the thousands to get into charter schools that offer traditional methods of teaching your associates have long ago discarded, and clear rules of right and wrong that you say can no longer be enforced. Tell me, Mr. President, why the other day I met the parents of a young Hispanic lad in a charter high school who voluntarily wears a tie every day and whose teachers describe him as a gentleman. Tell me why those parents had to pull him out of his regular school because they knew he was going to join a gang. But that school was established by a group of parents, this charter school, who were lectured by their local school board on how damaging that school would be to the children of that city, and the charter was only reluctantly passed. But the parents whose children attend that charter school do not see the damage. They see children coming home happy and full of new knowledge about old things every day. They see high school kids debating in class who the best founding father was. They see young ladies crying at the end of Jane Austen novels. Children who are not taught to read and write well in the school establishment, that you control, they see them reading the masters, Poe, Dickinson, and Shakespeare. Will those be fully unionized teachers, Mr. President, or do you want to get into particulars? Mr. President, you say you have finally brought better medical care or health insurance or necessary regulations to the health profession. You are really not very clear on what you have done, nor the doctors or patients. But there was a time in this country when doctors were not unknowledgeable about their patients and what they could afford and what treatments they ought to receive. I know that because my grandfather was a doctor, and I used to shell peas that the farmers brought him in lieu of cash payment and the steaks and other produce of their farms. And it was that way all around the country, Mr. President. You can read about it in that great American classic, To Kill a Mockingbird, which has great lessons both about race and equality, but also great lessons about how civil society and towns and neighborhoods work together when times are really hard, when in fact politicians in Washington made those times harder than they needed to be. Mr. President, do all these mind-numbing regulations which are driving experienced men and women in the medical world out of their profession and causing the best and brightest to think twice about entering it, are these regulations going to improve trust between doctor and patient? Mr. President, you can ask any doctor, particularly any obstetrician, about the high rate of unwed mothers in the country. What is the reason for this phenomenon? Could it be that in those schools we were talking about, bureaucracies at the state level, controlled by your party, have mandated a certain form of health curriculum? And we all know that health is just a code word for drugs and sex. In one state, the health class requirements are called, I kid you not, sexual performance standards. Mr. President, could it be instead of teaching children, for that is what they are, how to have umpteen different ways of safe sex, that's what we call it, that we should teach something to their souls? Could it be if we spent more time reading stories of love and family involving good men and women, the kinds of things that used to be read in schools, instead of being told where the nurse's office is so they can pick up their condoms? If the other thing happened, could it be true that these people might have some hope in this life, some hope of happiness and some knowledge about how to achieve it? Mr. President, we see the world differently. Where you see bigger government, I see lesser people. You call people who think the way I do greedy and not willing to give up a little more of their share. I see these same people founding charities and institutions that make human life worth living. And those people who do go to church, and they give money to their churches to do good in the neighborhoods to help the people they know. To them, a family on hard times, a child who needs some Christmas presents when his father has lost his job, is not just a number, is not part of a bureaucratic caseload. In those churches, the message is taught that man cannot live by bread alone. But what are the various programs you and your party have offered over the last 60 years other than the scraps of bread falling off an ever bigger government table? Where have they worked? In what state, in what city where the progressive liberal agenda is in charge, where has it worked? You asked what we're for, Mr. President. We're for towns where the only standing in line is that of families standing in line to see the feel-good movie of the year that all the critics will hate. Waiting to see the elephants and clowns in a circus. We're not for the monthly indignity of men and women standing in line for the so-called benefits you are the author of. Mr. President, we want to live in a world where the Boy Scouts do not become a tool of political opportunism. And while we're on the Boy Scouts, Mr. President, can you name one federal program your party has created in the last 60 years that has done more to build the character of the young people in this nation than the Boy Scouts? I shall be waiting for your answer. Mr. President, you say people who believe the things I do lack compassion. Well, let's try an experiment in compassion. Imagine your home in your neighborhood has just been devastated by a hurricane or other natural disaster, as we see happen in some place in this country every year. You're trying to sort out through the rubble and wondering what you and your children will do to restore your lives back to some order. You're beside yourself with the things you have lost. And then you look up and see someone coming down the driveway. Would you, in your heart of hearts, rather that person be a worker from the Red Cross or the Salvation Army, or a FEMA director? I am not trying to make a joke, Mr. President. Be honest. Mr. President, you have been in politics for a while now, in the State House in Illinois, in the U.S. Congress, and now as President. I would like to give you one illustration. I would like you to give one illustration, one example of a policy or a position that you have taken that has said yes to the can-do spirit of the American people, the spirit of Benjamin Franklin, and no to big government. Just one. We put our faith in different places, you and I am not talking about religion. You put your faith in an intrusive government that does more than what the Founding Fathers ever intended it to do in the Constitution. The Constitution you swear to uphold and then start listing a dozen reasons you do not uphold it. But, sir, the faith I have, the horse I'm backing in this race for which the stakes are nothing less than human freedom and happiness, is the American people. Every time. Thank you. Thank you. My plane didn't get in until about 2:30 last night. We were delayed for a long time in Detroit, where I came from. So I got sort of worked up as we were flying around the airport there. Must have been the weather. But at any rate, thank you for coming. We now have time for questions, I think, and I'd be happy to answer some. Yes, sir.
Hold on. Wait for the microphone.
Oh, yes. You're supposed to use the microphone.
I agree with your fulmination, but the problem is the president's not listening to you. Tyrants don't listen. We listen to them. Why hasn't someone called out what our current so-called president really is?
Okay, my answer to that is I think those who are running for office should do these things. And the frustration that I have, and I could spend all day, as probably you could as well, talking about Reagan. But Reagan never looked to whether a policy was politically viable or not. That was the one rule he had as governor of California from the very first day he was in office. He looked to things that were true, and therefore he said things that were true. And as he said in his farewell address, he said, "You call me the great communicator, and I'll take that. But I always thought that I wasn't a great communicator. It's that I communicated great things." And so my frustration is with the political class, who listen to some very popular and well-known people nowadays who tell them how to massage their message, or who listen to some of our friends in think tanks who adjust this policy or that policy, and that they don't speak to the heart. So I don't think he's listening to what's going on right now at the Kirby Center, but I hope somebody is, and I hope that politicians, or those who go into politics, and maybe better people need to go into politics in the first place, and Reagan said that time and time again, but they need to go back to true first principles. And this is not true just of politics, this is true of everything. So I hope that, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's that's the direction that I'm trying to move in. Another question. Whoever's doing the mics, who chooses? Yes, sir.
In speaking of civil society, and which current leaders or leaders coming up on the horizon do you think are promoting or could be promoting the renaissance of civil society as you're describing it?
Yes, sir. I don't like to play those games because I'm not a political analyst. You know, I know the names that we all know and we see on the television all the time, and I listen to them and I like some of the things that they say. Many of these people are very young right now, and so it'll be a test to see whether they stick to these principles. A lot of them have come out of the Tea Parties, and they seem very impressive. But I'm not backing a particular horse right now at the moment. I think that it's encouraging that there are young people, and I won't say in the party because it's not a party that I have an affiliation to, but there are young people in American politics now who seem determined not just to hone a message that gets votes, but actually to hone a message that's right. Yes, this gentleman here.
Thank you. I do have a question, but I just wanted to add one thing to your story about Ben Franklin, sort of prove that I am a Ben Franklin fan. One of the reasons, as you may know this, that the British wanted his help in deciding where to put lightning rods is because they had so many warehouses full of gunpowder. And when they got Franklin's help, they put the lightning rods on those warehouses, and that gunpowder stayed away from being blown up. And several years later, in the mid-1770s, that gunpowder was on British ships on its way to America to help put down a colonial rebellion. So there's that one irony. But my question is, and getting to the earlier question and to your talk about associations, and I know you've probably read the book Bowling Alone, so you know that he's talking along the same lines. If the federal government is now all pervasive, and we are sort of seeing now with our young people kind of a isolation with their video games and their computers and their texting and whatever. What do we do to bring back associations, to bring back that kind of underlying way that we got together as people again in small groups in small towns or whatever, and encourage that other than reduce the federal government? Are there any other things that we can do?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I wish a lot of parents would just say, turn off the television, turn off the video games, and too few, unfortunately, do that. The area that I'm most familiar with is the area of school formation. And on that front, I think there's a lot of hope because a lot of parents have figured it out that the schools, even in the very best communities, in nice communities, but nonetheless not good school districts, don't have the schools that they should have. And so these people are getting together and they're re-educating themselves in the things that they themselves were not educated in. And they're honing up on the classics. And so they're actually engaging in active civic participation, sometimes in a very heroic way, because they get called all kinds of things by the school establishment. And they have to take it from these people who denounce them in public meetings. And it's spreading like wildfire. And that is an important thing, because if you look at these schools, as Franklin did, as little institutions that do two things. They teach self-government in the classroom, because they teach the founding fathers, and they teach moral principles in the basic sense of moral self-government, but they also are models of how people come together in order to achieve an end. And they have to be political in the best sense of the word, in that they're participating in a polis structure for the common good. So that I see is pretty promising. In other aspects of civil society, and particularly if we were to get into the issue of culture, which is the broad brush that taints civil society, I don't see as much hope, but who knows? There are people out there who think that one of the advantages of the internet revolution is that people like me can publish books who are not liked by the New York establishment. I'm not going to put in another plug for my book, but it is about self-government during the Reagan years set in Texas. It involves baseball. But I hope that's helpful at least. Okay. This gentleman here.
I want to play a little game of what if. If
Okay.
you had written this speech and Romney had taken the speech and delivered it at the Republican convention, what would you surmise would be the reaction of
Oh,
the...
he would've won. Definitely.
My question is, what would be the reaction the next day of the establishment media? What would
Oh,
they be
would
saying?
go berserk. But we had that experiment, right? They went berserk all the time over Reagan. Reagan was the most pilloried man for 8 years of his life that you can ever imagine. I was just a kid then, but you know, it was every day. It was constant, and there was no alternative media. Star Wars, for example, he was laughed out of the house because of Star Wars. The Evil Empire speech, they thought he was such a troglodyte for talking about right and wrong. Did that ever cost him a vote? No, it created the phenomenon known as the Reagan Democrats. Franklin went into their territory. He got union votes. He got the votes of the young. He fought for the things that we've just declared are off limits now because we've calculated it because of this stupid way of so many conservatives, so many liberals, and so many people in between, this age group, that age group, this occupational group. Reagan didn't hold to any of that, which is why in his inaugural he made that great statement about that special interest that's been so long overlooked, the special interest we call the American people. So whether, you know, my speech or not, I don't know whether that's the thing. It'd probably have to be refined a little bit. I just wrote it in one night. But I think some good red meat stuff would have done wonders, particularly in that third debate. Oh my gosh, the anchor gave him the perfect setup. Why didn't he ask the question why those men were not protected and supported? Why didn't he ask the question, which is the first thing that I heard when I first heard the news, where are the dead Marines? You don't get into American embassies and consulates in this world on September 11th, as dangerous as it is, without Marines guarding the whole place. And those folks don't go down without a fight. Nothing. I think if he would have went after him, he would have won. Other people look at the demographics and say no, but I was disappointed. And I think a lot of people were. I mean, I don't want this to turn into a Romney bashing session. I mean, I think he's a fine man, and he tried to run a very upstanding campaign, and that I'm not trying to second guess anybody, but that's my opinion. Yeah, this lady here.
Thank you. What role, if any, do you think mainline churches have had in the degradation of civil society?
Let me see if I understand what that question means. What role have the, I see what you're saying. Okay, so they're compromising on certain moral issues, particularly those around sex. Well, the church has become like any institution, like the school or anything else. If you actually trace what goes on at divinity schools and theology schools, for the most part, I don't know as much about the professors. I know a lot of good professors, and I read a lot who are serious theologians. But I know that a lot of the people who go into the ministry, and I was told this by a friend who I had who taught at a seminary, and his graduate students would get in there, and they would start reading Luther, or they'd start reading Calvin, and they would ask questions such as, wow, these guys are really worked up about sin. Did they like have sexual hang-ups or what? What do you say to that? I mean, there is a thing called the Bible, and there's a whole variety of theology that comes after the Bible. So it seems like to me that is the message that you carry. And in the same way that the political message ought to be, these are the founding principles, and these actually work, and we've shown them to work. It seems like a church is a similar institution. And so compromising with the church's fundamental mission, I object to, but yeah, I haven't worked out how much it actually changes things politically. What I worry more about is that the right kind of messages aren't being told to congregations, particularly in the area of sexuality and particularly when it regards young women. And I think if somebody just got up and gave a good story about David or Adam and Eve, that young people would actually respond to it, because they're not told how to handle their sexuality. Who tells them that? So that's as best I can do with that question.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
Yeah, just following up on that a little bit, you said of Reagan that he had faith in America, that he also said Dixon, Illinois was heaven. He said, I learned standards and values there. And obviously he was a great believer in the civil society, as you said, and in individualism and the integrity of the individual and so on. But I'm wondering if you could place then under sort of standards and values what the religious and faith basis was, including in Dixon or wherever, in Reagan's thought and influence, therefore, on his other thoughts, religious liberty and things like that.
So you're asking me about Reagan's piety, his own personal piety?
His own personal faith, and whether it or not it was basically the basis for all the other things you were saying.
Right.
In
Okay.
other words, the values, those are
Right.
Christian values that he learned at First Christian Church in Dixon.
Right. No, I think it's throughout Reagan's speeches. I mean, you can scarcely read a Reagan speech that doesn't have some reference to God. He wasn't, I never found him to be political as choosing one religion over another, but he broadly embraced religion in this country and saw its importance for maintaining a moral standing and being, in a way, the source of the rock of truth. The other thing that I was going to say is, and I didn't put this into the talk, but I thought a lot about it, is, you know, when you divide up the lines of who gets to talk about what, and the Democrats are happy to talk about anything. They talk about the economy, but they'd rather talk about other stuff. They're more comfortable with that. And the Republicans always seem really ham-handed and uncomfortable with that. What very often happens is the one area where conservative candidates are comfortable is in talking about religion, because that's the local society that they see the most of. They go to church every Sunday. And that's where they see a lot of good being done in the way of charity and all kinds of things. That's where they see marriages taking place. But the problem is that every time a conservative candidate does that, he risks being declared, you know, an evangelical, a right-wing evangelical fanatic, and can't, you know, keep the difference straight between God and politics. And that just never seemed to bother Reagan. I mean, he just said what he wanted to say and let them howl all they wanted to. I do think that there are some issues where candidates need to be careful about how they express themselves, because sometimes they speak from what appears to be the basis of faith, but it doesn't seem to me to be faith at all. And in particular in this last election, these comments about rape, those just, it was just stupid. And I don't think there's any place in the Bible or any church or anything that should say that. I mean, when you say something like that, it seems to lack compassion. And then when you talk about the age of the universe and whether you believe in science and all the rest of it, conservatives sometimes get tangled up in that too, rather than just having a simple modesty and say, you know, like Rubio was just asked, well, how old is the Earth? Why didn't you just say, go ask a geologist? You know, I'm a political man. I nearly failed geology when I was in school. I mean, if he would have just given that answer, he would not, I don't think he would alienate anybody in the religious right. And he doesn't give somebody something to hang himself with. So, but what Reagan based his talking about religion in was truth, and were the virtues of charity and the virtue of modesty, frankly. And if there's one virtue that Reagan had in abundance that comes straight out of the Bible, and it seems to me that the progressives do not have at all, that is humility. And so if there's one Christ-like lesson that could be taught every election, that I wish politicians would frankly say, we have to be humble here, because we're humans and you're trying to do God-like things. Are you God? If you throw that back at them, I wonder how they would respond to that. So I hope that's helpful. This gentleman says amen. So sermon's over. Thank you.